Francisco. I am a wildlife artist, and today we're going to be talking about paper. One of the most common things that I see asked online is whether or not I need to use good drawing paper. And if I do, what kind do I use? There are so many considerations that go into deciding which drawing surface to use, and we're going to be talking about all of them today. A lot of artists, particularly beginners, use whatever surface is available to them. And generally that's printer paper or cartridge paper. Some of that paper can actually be pretty good when you're just using it for sketching or some initial drawings, something like that. But once you get past the beginner phase, it's important for you to start looking at other drawing surfaces. Number one, printer paper is very flimsy, so it's very easy to tear, it's very easy to smudge, and it's very easy to crinkle. You don't want that if you have any sort of, important drawings that you're going to be doing. The other thing is that it's not the best for blending. Printer paper, regardless of its surface, does tend to smudge very easily, and so it doesn't really teach you how to blend properly. And then the final thing is that, well, actually there's two other things. The other thing is that it doesn't hold the graphite. If you're using graphite, it doesn't hold the graphite very well, so it will fade very quickly over time. Graphite on any surface will fade over time if it's exposed to sunlight, but particularly on cheap paper, it tends to fade very, very quickly. Also, if you're using a medium like colored pencil or pastels, it doesn't have the tooth to really do the best that it can for those types of mediums. So because of all of that, it's important to start looking at other types of higher end papers so that as your abilities improve, you can also get used to doing things like textures and blending properly, all of that kind of stuff. There are so many things to consider when choosing a drawing surface that it could easily become overwhelming. So the very first piece of advice that I have to give you is that nothing beats experimentation. Make sure that you go out and you try lots of different types of paper to find the surface that works best for you. What you can remember is that a lot of the paper companies, they sell little packets that are full of their different drawing papers, so you can experiment and you can try different surfaces to see what you like. But nothing beats going to an art store, if at all possible, and just feeling the paper and looking at the weights and looking at the colors and seeing what works best for you. Here are a few of the considerations to take. Number one, what fiber that the paper is made of. Papers can be made of all kinds of things: cottons, jutes, cellulose. They can be made of lots of bamboo, things like that. There are just so many different types of fibers that paper can be made of, and each one has a different acidity to it. Cellulose papers tend to have a high acid level. The thing to remember is that if you see a paper with a high acid level, what that means is that it's going to degrade faster. So you want to try to stick to papers that are cotton papers unless you're using the paper for sketching and just, sort of basic design ideas, that kind of thing. Cottons do tend to be considered the highest quality paper because they tend to have the lowest acidity to them. Paper can come in a couple of different forms. It can come in the form of pads like these, and it can also come in single sheets like you see here. And there are various sizes of the single sheets, everything from the smaller sheets to, I don't remember, I think it's like 32 by 60, something like that, exactly what they are. But you can get these from places online. You can usually get the sheets from art stores. A lot of times you do have to order these online though. I think that the single sheets are easier to get online. Having said that, so they do come in a couple of different forms. It's going to be up to you. What are the pluses and minuses? Well, the pluses are that the pads are easier to carry. They are already set. You don't have to cut them. They don't have any of the deckled edges, anything like that. But that does mean that you can't use any sort of strange sizes. If you wanted to, create a size of for your drawing that's out of the norm, in other words, that isn't like 11 by 14 or something that's available in the pad, then obviously you wouldn't be able to do that with the pad. You would want to go with one of the independent sheets, one of the single sheet papers. So that's one of the pluses of the single sheets. The other thing is that it tends to be easier to find the unusual papers in the single sheets, not so much with the pads of paper. It's a lot harder to find like colored sheets or the thicker papers in the pads of paper. I'll give you an example of that, which is the Stonehenge, which is the branded paper Stonehenge Craft, which is this brown paper. I have not yet found it in a pad of paper, so I don't believe, don't quote me on that, but I don't believe that they sell this in the pad of paper. So some of these colored papers are not able to be found in the pads. The other thing to consider are the different textures of paper. There is hot press, there is cold press, there is rough. Craft, which is this Stonehenge Craft, is what you would consider to be a rough texture of paper. Most papers, by the way, have a textured side and they have a smooth side. So when you talk about a texture of a paper, you're really talking about the texture of the rough side. And this craft paper is more of a rough type paper. I always say that it kind of feels like the old paper bags, the old paper grocery bags. That's kind of the texture that it reminds me of. It's a little bit thicker. So there are even more rough surfaces, paper surfaces, than this craft paper, but it would be considered that. And then you have the cold press water paper color, and then you have the hot press. When people talk about a cold press surface, what they're talking about is it's the kind of bumpy sort of a surface. It is the more textured of the surfaces. Hot press is a smooth surface. Also, when you talk about a vellum surface, you're talking about more of a kind of a textured or more of a bumpy surface. The last consideration, well, there's actually two more considerations there with the papers. One is the weight of the paper. The thinner the paper, typically, but not always, the less expensive that it is. And the thicker the paper, typically, but not always, it's considered kind of a finer paper. The Fabriano line of papers, for example, are a really fine line of watercolor papers. They come in multiple colors, and each of the colors has a different surface. That's the other thing that you need to remember, is that even in a single line of paper, it can come in different surfaces. I'm going to talk to you next about surfaces. So let's talk about what the different textures of paper matter. Cold pressed watercolor paper is like I told you, it's kind of a bumpier textured, more of a textured type of a paper. If you're doing really fine detailed drawings with graphite, it's probably not the best paper to use because a lot of that detail is going to get lost in the texture. But if you are doing a drawing where texture is required, if you're, say, doing a landscape, or if you're doing something that requires textures of rocks or things like that, then the cold press can actually be really helpful for you because it can do part of the work for you. It can kind of create some of the texture for you. Another place where textured paper would be called for would be if you're using colored pencils. Colored pencils are layered. When you use colored pencils, you layer, and you layer tons and tons, sometimes 20 layers of the pencil. And the textured paper will grab onto that and will take many more layers than a more smooth surface will. So that can be really helpful, and it will take some of the textured paper will take some detail. It's just not going to show off the really fine detail like, for example, a Bristol paper will. A Bristol paper is extremely smooth, and you will see a lot of really super highly detailed artists do gravitate more towards the Bristol papers. Bristol is super smooth, like I said, and it only comes in white, but it does come in sheets and in the sheets and in the pads, so you can get it either way. Hot press watercolor paper is also a smooth paper, and so it is also really good for detailed work. It tends to be a little bit softer than the Bristol paper, which is a really super smooth, really super flat surface to it. So it's just pretty much a matter of taste whether you prefer the hot press watercolor paper over the Bristol. Smooth papers like a Bristol paper or like a hot press watercolor paper, they do give you a bit more control. So that's something to think about if you're an artist who likes to have a lot of really fine detail in your work. It is important for you to be able to have control over each of the marks and control over the amount of detail, and a really smooth paper is going to give you that. Whereas a cold press watercolor paper, something that has more tooth to it or has more texture to it, is going to be less controlled. So it's going to be harder for you to get all of the super fine strokes and the super fine marks to really show up and pop. So that's something to think about and consider when you're choosing paper also. The last two things to consider when choosing a paper are color and weight. Thing to remember is that even among the same manufacturer, the different colors are going to have a different texture most likely. Not with all manufacturers, but with most of them that's what happens. For example, here with Stonehenge, their blue and their off-white papers are have a slightly textured feeling to them, whereas their brown craft has a super textured feel, almost a rough texture, and their off-white is really smooth. With Fabriano, which is the paper that I just love, their extra white watercolor paper, hot press watercolor paper, is super smooth, but their regular white hot press watercolor paper actually has a little bit of texture to it. So it's important to try to experiment and to try to look around at a lot of different papers to play around and find the one that works best for you. The final thing is when we talk about paper weights. Traditionally, papers are measured by either pounds or by what's called GSM, which is grams per square meter. And you'll see those when you purchase on the pads of paper. When you purchase them, it will say, you know, 250G or 250 GSM or whatever the GSM is. If you're buying the individual sheets, then it should say it on the website. What that means is the higher number, basically the thing to remember is that the higher the number, the thicker the paper is going to be. And the thicker the paper is going to be, the more surface it has in order to grab onto water, colored pencil, even graphite. So thicker papers do tend to be considered finer papers. The thinner papers tend to be easier to smudge. They tend to take less of whatever medium that you're using, so that's something to consider also. Some people prefer the thinner papers. I tend to go with kind of a medium GSM with the Bristol paper. That's one of my favorites for doing graphite because it is a bright, Bristol paper tends to be a bright, stark white, and it tends to be extremely smooth, and it's just thick enough to where it really kind of shows off my work. I also like the Fabriano extra white hot press watercolor paper because it does have a smooth surface, but it is a little bit softer, and so when I'm doing some work that has kind of a detailed fine background, like for a forest or something like that, I just find that I like the kind of softer look to it a little bit, whereas the Bristol paper tends to make the lines really sharp. So anyway, I hope that all of that was helpful for you. If you have any questions about papers, please feel free to go ahead and leave them down in the comments below. Or if you have any suggestions for other art supplies that you would like to have me review or have me give demonstrations of, you can leave those down there too. And remember to hit the subscribe button down below so that you don't miss any of my future videos. Thanks so much. Bye. Stay tuned for my upcoming series of videos where I will be drawing the same subject on different drawing surfaces so that you can see how different textures affect the way a drawing looks.